like to welcome everybody to the Montague Museum's Talk the Walk. And we're sitting down here at the bike trailhead at the gazebo. And we're going to cover, we're right here on this spot. We're going to cover the things in this area. From this location, we're going to cover the railroad depot, which was right up here.
The Montague Railroad Depot. Railroad tracks were built between Muskegon and Montague in 1870. However, the Ferry brothers, using their own money, built the depot a year later in 1871. It was located on the south end of Spring Street, on the SE side. The Muskegon Chronicle, August 23, 1871, published the traveler's guide that the train coming from Muskegon would deliver mail at Montague at 7 a.m. and leave at 6 p.m. That first depot building lasted 12 years before it burned down August 1, 1883. According to the Whitehall Forum, August 2, 1883, the wood structure burned to the ground despite prompt and energetic action of the fire companies. The cause of the fire was unknown, but it was believed a sawdust fire nearby sparked the fire. The value of the building was believed to be about $1,000, not counting additional contents lost. It was reported that the builder, Elmer Curtis, was working hard to complete the rebuilding by fall. The depot was successfully completed in September 1883. Yet again, repeat fires in 1893 and 1895 burned the depot. The Whitehall Forum reported on July 27, 1893, a sawdust fire broke out, and when the wind shifted, it headed right for the depot. Both the Whitehall and Montague fire companies battled the fire along with the Montague Waterworks. It took all day to put the fire out in the burning sawdust. After the 1895 fire, the author of the Whitehall Forum article, November 7, 1895, covering the yet again tragedy, suggested that it might be wise if the flammable area of sawdust was covered over with sand. In 1910, the railroad recognized that they would have to lower the surrounding platforms where loading and unloading of trains took place. The higher platforms had been efficient when handling goods but were more dangerous for people to navigate. Safety won over potential lawsuits. By 1926, the Pierre Marquette RR had been on shaky fiscal grounds for some time and made the decision to tear down both the Montague and Whitehall depots. A new depot was built in Whitehall with the salvaged lumber, where the current White Lake Chamber is located. This ended all passenger service for the area.
Next is the White Lake Creamery.
White Lake Creamery Company, Montague. The creamery was built in March 1911, on River Street behind the Ironworks Foundry, near the old Pierre Marquette Passenger and Freight Railroad Depot. A requirement for operations manager was to be a trained buttermaker. At least was John E. Freightner, a 1913 graduate of the Dairy Department of Michigan Agricultural College, now MSU. Each of the first three buttermakers stayed in the position for only a year before moving on, until A.A. Bertram came along. He remained for 6 years. The creamery collected milk from the local farmers with a horse and buggy and was very time-consuming, so by 1920, a large motorized Oldsmobile truck was purchased. This cut collecting milk time down to a few hours instead of a whole day, also helping to maintain the quality of milk, especially on hot summer days. Another time saver implemented in 1920 was the purchase of a state-of-the-art churn with a 1,000-pound capacity. Creameries needed ice for their process and had to maintain an ice house to store ice. Yearly bids were put out to fill the ice house, and an interesting example of such contracts was Peter Anderson's 1915 low bid of $43.90 for cutting, hauling, and packing 30 cords of ice. Fire was a constant and frequent threat to buildings as all were wood-built. In June 1920, the creamery's roof caught on fire, most likely from their smokestack or possibly from a locomotive train passing by. The local fire department was using a chemical truck to assist with fires by this date, and they successfully extinguished it. Overhead continued to increase and customers were declining, so the creamery shut down in November 1926. Another creamery started up in the same location with a new owner in 1927 and continued operation until 1935. After that, Rufus Hunt continued to use the ice house for another 10 years, when a new owner tore it down.
Then Wilson and Henry Foundry, which is right up this way where Montague Foods is, they built steam engines and did ironwork for the mills around the lake. So if they needed a pillow block for bearings, they cast them and machined them and built a lot of steam engines. And then after lumbering went out, they continued to build steam engines for the shipping industry. There was a lot of them around the country from Montague Iron Works. Now we're going to move over to the bridge and cover the logging era. We're at stop 2 now on the railroad bridge on the White River right here. The bike trail, the river, the bridge. We're going to be talking about 4 locations here. This is looking up the river. The Ferry Dowling, the shingle mill is where the Dog and Suds is by the river. The railroad bridge from the Dog and Suds building. And this is looking down the river out into White Lake. Ferry Dowling shingle mill is where the Dog and Suds was. And you wonder where these airborne pictures were taken. Well, it's from these roof or these windows on this mill. This is the picture looking upriver of the booming company where they sorted all the logs that came down the river. The first guys at the booming upriver sorted right and left, Montague and Whitehall. Then as they came down, they sorted them by the mills and put them into pens, and then they were either shuttled into the boomsticks or into rafts to tow down the lake. This is the bridge between Montague and Whitehall, which was the swing bridge to get the tugboats up to get the rafts. You can see the boomsticks down the lake too. Here's another picture of the booming grounds with the office for the company there. Okay, we're here at stop 3. We're going to be talking about the Ferry Dowling Mill, which is right across the road. The slip looking north on Dowling Street. The Ferry Dowling Mill. You can see the bridge here, right through here, where the logs came in from the back. This was all the boom back here. No campground, no insurance buildings. They floated the logs under the bridge here into the mill, sawed the logs, loaded them on the ships, and they went to Chicago.
Ferry, Dowling and Company. Mill 1865. The Ferry brothers, E.P. and T.W., partnered with George E. Dowling to form the Ferry, Dowling Company, known as Big Red Mill, or the Old Red Mill. It was located on the west side of Dowling Street near the current Weathervane Inn. As the logs were brought down the river, they were pushed from a lagoon on the east side of Dowling through an opening under Dowling Street to the mill. Initially, the Big Red Mill was considered a large-size mill, employing 50 men who produced 50,000 board feet daily through the early 1880s. However, while other mills continued to expand, the Big Red Mill had not. By 1877, the Ferry brothers were out of the mill business, with E.P. moving out west for the mining business and T.W. being involved in politics as a senator since early on in their mill ownership. George Dowling took over the business. Then in 1891, The mill's original double circular saw was partially dismantled, removing one of the circular blades as part of the new business plan to manufacture lath and boom wedges. Lath is made from slabs and used in construction of buildings. Boom wedges were used by lumbermen for towing a boom of logs, as in tying logs together to form a raft for towing them downriver. Both products were successful. 20,000 laths were produced daily. 200,000 boom wedges were produced in a season. George Dowling sold the Big Red Mill to the ironworks owners, Wilson and Hendry, in 1893, who moved the building's frame and converted it into a boiler house for the ironworks. William Lipka was tearing off old shingles on his house in 1924 when he came across old shingles with the Ferry, Dowling and Company brand. Meaning his house must have been shingled during the 1870s, as the mill ceased operations in 1877.
We're looking up the street towards the hotel, Hornberger Building, the old Masonic Temple, Banks's Barn. This here's the slip. Boats in. This mill is right here. You see the Ferry Memorial Church up here on the hill. This is a piece of the downtown from a different angle over behind us here. We're stopped for here at the Launch Ramp Road and Knutson Street. You can see the marina, the band shell, the launch ramp area. That's where we're standing right now. This spot we're going to cover Dowling Ferry Mill behind us, the boat slip. You can see the Fair Memorial Church up here. There was, between this point and Ferry Dowling Mill, was a D.C. Bowen shingle mill.
A.B. Bowen and D.C. Bowen Mill in 1866. This father and son came to Montague from Wisconsin with the purpose of building a shingle mill. They located it just west of the Ferry Dowling Mill, on the north side of White Lake, Montague. A.B. Bowen was a man involved in a variety of pursuits throughout his adult life in Wisconsin. Real estate and platting land around Fond du Lac, watching steamers running between Fond du Lac and Oshkosh, and becoming aware of water power in the lower Fox River. With such a background, perhaps he read about the lumbering enterprises in West Michigan or spent time talking with others that lead him to bring his son to this area for the singular purpose of building a shingle mill. We really don't know much about him, his son, or their mill. We do know that many people saw opportunity in lumber, even though they knew it wasn't going to last. D.C. Bowen, son of A.B., had brought his family from Wisconsin over to Montague, where it is known they lived in Oceana, Muskegon County, in 1870, and then in 1880 the family of 6 children had moved to Montague. D.C. died November 9, 1897, in Kansas City, Missouri. A.B. Bowen had returned to Wisconsin and died in Oshkosh in 1882.
Looking up Knutson Street here, you're seeing the Temple curtain roll.
Temple and Company. Curtain Roll Ansel French Temple arrived in Montague in 1872 and formed a partnership with E.P. Ferry to manufacture curtain rollers, or window shades as we might refer to them today. The company buildings were on the SW corner of Knudsen and Ferry. Local wood was a ready source for manufacturing the wooden rollers as well as any other similar products: curtain sticks, map mountings, mop or broom handles. The roller business flourished with large orders shipped across the country. By 1877, 4 large 100 feet by 47 feet buildings were constructed for storing rollers and map mountings. It was about this time that Temple took over Ferry's partnership to become the sole owner. In April 1878, they had sold $14,000 in products in the first 3 months of the year and were building additions to their storage. Interestingly, he had a telegraph line put in the office for convenience in making and receiving dispatches. As so often happened in those times, on December 11, 1878, fire destroyed the main building, as well as neighbor, Mr. Bowen's barn and additional sheds. It was a total loss for Temple, and with no insurance, he still seemed upbeat and proceeded to go about building again. Fire hit a second time just 5 months later, with equipment valued at $25,000, but this time insured for $15,000. Mr. Bowen got hit again with the loss of his boarding house, as well as others who had grain and feed stored at the house. It isn't as though they had built without safety measures for fires, because fires were so prevalent. If you look at the picture, you will see the barrels of water stored on the building's roof. That gave the men a handy source of water to fight their fires. This second fire put 60 men and boys out of work, and unfortunately for them, this time Temple moved his business to Muskegon. In 1884, the Muskegon business also caught on fire. He rebuilt, and in 1892 he sold it to Stuart Hartshorn, retaining his interest in the company and becoming manager of the western branch of the firm. Temple was 72 when he died on December 24, 1914, in Muskegon, on Washington Street.
This is a piece of the slip after lumbering went out when the launches brought people to Montague and Whitehall. If you wanted to launch, you just went out on your dock and waved the flag, and they picked you up and brought you to town. Made trips around the lake. If you were down at Sylvan Beach and wanted to come to town, you just went out on your dock and waved the flag, pick you up and drop you off in Montague or Whitehall or wherever you wanted to go around the lake. Frank White's mill was a big mill. It was down just off of where the band shell is located, between there and the launch ramp. It was a good-sized mill. You can see the Fair Memorial Church in the background here.
Frank H. White Mill. Frank White built a steam-powered mill in 1871 to 72 and operated for some 18 years before closing in 1888. Located on the north side of White Lake near the bridge over White River. It was a small mill, employing 40 men including inside and outside workers, who produced 10,000 feet of board in 11 hours with one upright circular saw. C. Smith, engineer. John Orenberger was a filer. J. Hulbert and G. Henderson were sawyers, would have been inside workers. The daily wage for the outside workers was 10 to 11 shillings. Apparently, there was growing discontent with the wage, and on May 9, 1887, the outside workers went on strike, shutting the mill down, for an increased wage of 12 shillings a day. By noon that day, a compromise was reached for 11 to 12 shillings. Work was supposed to begin immediately that afternoon. However, the inside workers had spent their unexpected time off that morning in a more leisure way and were in no shape to resume work. So, the mill closed up for the rest of the day. The mill operated just another year, closing down in September 1888 and torn down in March 1889. The ferry mill took over the property from Frank White, thus expanding the ferry mill operations. There was a connection between the Whites and the Ferry families. Frank White was married to Amanda Ferry, sister to the brothers who owned the ferry mill. Frank White remained in Montague until his death on January 10, 1893. At the age of 51, he was buried in the Lake Forest Cemetery, Grand Haven, his original home, as it was for the Ferry family.
I'd like to thank all of you for attending the walk today for the Montague Museum. Come up and visit us. We're open weekends and Wednesday afternoons. I'm just sitting here finishing up the walking tour, and I'd like to thank the people that put this all together. Denise Marquardt, who is president of the museum, Greg Johnson, who did all the camera work and sound, Mary G., who did a lot of the typing and editing, Barbara Badeau, who helped with a lot of the writings, Kurt Weber, and Jerry Grady, who helped with pictures. It's been a wonderful time, beautiful day. Thank you for coming. Come visit us at the museum.